The Pacific was endless, a canvas of blue stretching beyond the horizon. But in that vast ocean, one empire ruled both the waves and the skies: Japan. The rising sun wasn't just a symbol, it was a warning. A message written across the clouds: the empire controls the air. From the Philippines to Wake Island, from Burma to Pearl Harbor, the world had learned to fear a single sound: the high-pitched scream of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. It wasn't just a fighter plane, it was a predator. The Zero could turn sharper, climb faster, and fly farther than almost anything the Allies had. It could hit hard and disappear just as fast. To American pilots in the early days of the war, the Zero was a nightmare that lived above the sea. Dogfights were hopeless. The U.S. P-40s and Wildcats were sluggish, heavy, and outperformed at every angle. Even the bravest pilots admitted it. The Japanese owned the skies. But every empire that rules too long forgets one truth: somewhere, someone is always building the thing that will destroy it. Across the ocean in California, a team of engineers at North American Aviation worked in silence. They weren't heroes or soldiers. They were dreamers, men who believed that speed and power could save lives. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to design the machine that would change everything. The Japanese had the Zero. The Americans were about to have the Mustang. In the early months of 1940, Britain was desperate. German bombers roared over London every night. The Royal Air Force was losing men faster than it could train replacements. They needed more planes. Fast. So they reached out to America. North American Aviation was asked to build Curtiss P-40s for the RAF. But company president James Dutch Kindleberger had another idea. He said, "We can build you something better." That decision, one moment of ambition, changed aviation history. Within 120 days, the first prototype of the P-51 Mustang was born. It was sleek, modern, and different from anything else in the sky. But at first, nobody believed in it. The early Mustangs were underpowered. They looked fast, but the engine couldn't deliver the punch needed for combat. So while Japan's Zeros continued to dominate, the Mustang sat in the shadows, waiting for its moment. That moment came when the British installed the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same engine that powered the Spitfire. When they tested the new hybrid, pilots couldn't believe their eyes. The plane climbed faster, flew higher, and traveled farther than any fighter before it. The Mustang wasn't just another aircraft. It was a new kind of weapon, a long-range escort that could fly with bombers all the way to the heart of enemy territory. And when it arrived in the Pacific, everything changed. By 1944, Japan's once invincible sky empire began to tremble. The Zero that once struck fear into the hearts of American pilots was now being hunted by something faster, stronger, and deadlier. The P-51 Mustang had arrived, and it didn't come alone. American squadrons swept across the Pacific like a storm. Mustangs flew higher than the Zeros could reach, faster than the Zeros could chase, and with guns that shredded metal like paper. For the first time, Japanese pilots looked up and saw death coming for them, painted silver, with the insignia of the United States Air Force. One Japanese officer would later write, "We could no longer touch the enemy. They appeared in the sun, attacked in formation, and disappeared like ghosts. The Mustang made us feel powerless." The tables had turned. But power in war isn't just about machines, it's about the men who fly them. The Mustang gave the Allies hope, but it was the courage of the pilots that made it legendary. Young men, barely 20 years old, climbed into those cockpits knowing that each mission could be their last. They flew through anti-aircraft fire, through storms, through enemy territory, to protect the bombers on their way to Japan. The Japanese called them the Silver Demons. They came from the clouds without warning, struck with perfect precision, and vanished into the sun. The once fearsome Zeros now burned in the air they once ruled. And for the first time since the war began, Japan's skies no longer belonged to Japan. The sound of the Zero, once a song of victory, was now drowned out by the deep, thunderous roar of the Mustang's Merlin engine. It was more than a plane. It was a symbol, a message to the world. No empire lasts forever. And in the skies above Japan, that message was written in smoke. The P-51 Mustang had taken control, the hunters had become the hunted, and the rising sun was beginning to fall. It began with frustration. The American pilots were losing too many friends, too many missions. Every battle report was the same. The Japanese Zeros dominated the sky. Something had to change. At the North American Aviation plant in Inglewood, California, engineers worked day and night under fluorescent lights and war pressure. The air inside smelled of oil, metal, and cigarettes. They didn't have time for sleep or failure. They had one mission: to build a plane that could win. James Kindleberger, the man who led them, was not an ordinary businessman. He believed machines could change the world. And when the British government came asking for help, he saw it as a chance to prove it. The first Mustang prototype, designated NA-73X, rolled out in October 1940. It looked beautiful. Sleek lines, laminar flow wings, and a body that seemed to slice through the air. But when it took off for the first time, the pilots realized beauty wasn't enough. The Allison engine inside couldn't breathe at high altitudes. Above 15,000 feet, it struggled for air, while the German and Japanese fighters owned the skies at 25,000 and beyond. The Mustang was fast, but not fast enough to win the war. The disappointment was heavy. Some engineers thought the project would be canceled, but a few refused to give up. They believed the design was too good to die. All it needed was the right heart, a new engine that could make it soar, and that heart came from Britain. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power that carried the Spitfire through the Battle of Britain, was offered for testing. When they installed it in the Mustang, the world changed. The first test flight shocked everyone. The Mustang climbed higher, faster, and further than any American fighter ever had. It could escort bombers from England to Berlin, and later from Iwo Jima all the way to Tokyo. The Mustang had evolved. It was no longer just a plane, it was a weapon of dominance. By 1943, production lines were roaring. Workers, men and women, riveted the silver bodies together, their faces streaked with sweat and metal dust. Every piece of aluminum, every screw, every bolt, built with the hope that maybe this machine would bring someone's brother home alive. Thousands of Mustangs rolled off the line, their engines echoing across the hangars like a chorus of thunder. Each one carried a promise: freedom through air power. When the first squadrons arrived in the Pacific, American pilots could finally fight back. They looked at their new machines with pride and disbelief. One pilot said, "For the first time, we felt equal." No, we felt stronger. They trained for weeks, takeoffs, landings, combat maneuvers, learning how to turn the Mustang into an extension of their own instincts. Its .650 caliber machine guns roared like thunder when fired together, spitting out 800 rounds every 15 seconds. Each bullet carried the weight of every fallen friend. When the Mustangs met the Zeros for the first time, the difference was immediate. The Japanese pilots, used to dominating, suddenly found themselves being hunted. Their light, agile planes were deadly in close combat, but the Mustang didn't need to get close. It could strike from above, dive fast, and climb out before the enemy could react. In one of the first encounters over the Mariana Islands, an American squadron engaged a formation of Zeros. In just 7 minutes, the battle was over. 10 Japanese fighters were down. Not a single Mustang was lost. That day, the myth of the invincible Zero began to die. But victory didn't come cheap. The Pacific skies were still deadly. Flak bursts filled the air like black flowers, and Japanese anti-aircraft guns lined every coast. Many Mustang pilots never returned home. They became part of the ocean, their names written in the silence beneath the waves. Still, more pilots volunteered. They called it the long ride home, because the Mustang could finally take them deep into Japan, to the heart of the empire. Each flight meant hours of silence, broken only by the hum of the Merlin engine. Some said that sound was comforting. Others said it was haunting, like the heartbeat of the war itself. As they flew closer to the enemy homeland, they saw the cities below: Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, once untouchable, now within reach. For the first time, Japan's war machine trembled. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just a fighter. It was a message carried on silver wings. It told the world that technology and courage together could rewrite destiny. And in 1944, that destiny was about to unfold in the skies above Japan. By early 1944, the Pacific War had changed. The Americans had taken Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, islands that brought Japan within flying distance. From these new bases, the long-range bombers, the B-29 superfortresses, prepared to strike the Japanese homeland. But they needed protection. They needed the P-51. The Mustang had finally arrived. Its silver body gleamed under the tropical sun, its nose painted with colors: red, blue, yellow, each marking a squadron, each telling a story. When the engines roared together, the sound echoed across the island like a storm brewing in the distance. Every pilot knew what was coming. The next phase of the war wasn't just about islands or oceans, it was about air dominance over Japan itself, and the Japanese knew it too. The first missions began at dawn. Rows of Mustangs lined up on the coral airstrips, propellers spinning, exhaust smoke rising like morning fog. Pilots sat in silence for a moment. Some prayed, some stared ahead, some just breathed deeply. The flight leader's voice came through the radio. "Gentlemen, let's bring the war to their doorstep." One by one, they took off, lifting into the blue Pacific sky. Their destination, Tokyo. At 25,000 feet, the world looked calm. White clouds, endless ocean. But beneath that calm waited flak, fighters, and death. Hours passed. Then, on the horizon, Japan, a land of mountains, rivers, and smoke. Below them, the cities pulsed with life. Factories, ships, trains, the beating heart of the empire. And then the alarms began to ring. Japanese radar detected the incoming formation. Across airfields near Tokyo and Yokohama, Zero fighters scrambled into the air. The pilots were veterans, disciplined, fearless, but tired. They'd been fighting since Pearl Harbor, and now the sky itself seemed to turn against them. The Mustangs dived from high altitude, the sun at their backs. In seconds, the sky erupted. Tracer rounds streaked like fireflies. Engines screamed. The sound of gunfire mixed with the roar of the wind. One Japanese pilot later recalled, "We couldn't touch them. They came down from above so fast, and when we turned, they were gone." The P-51's speed and power were unmatched. Its Merlin engine let it climb higher and dive faster than any Zero could follow. Japanese fighters tried to outturn them, but every maneuver ended the same way: smoke trails and falling metal. On the ground, civilians watched in horror. They had never seen American planes so close, so fast. For years, they'd been told their Air Force was unbeatable. But now, the Silver Mustangs flew freely above their cities, chasing Japanese planes like hawks hunting doves. At night, when the bombers came, the Mustangs escorted them, black shadows against the glow of firestorms below. Tokyo burned, and the message was clear: Japan could no longer hide. In one mission over the Japanese mainland, Captain John "Red" Edwards led his squadron of 8 Mustangs against nearly 30 Zeros. The radio crackled with chaos, shouts, gunfire, static. But Red's voice was calm. "Keep your altitude. Pick your shots. Don't let them pull you in." For 30 minutes, they fought above Mount Fuji. Clouds of black smoke rose through the thin air. By the end, 15 Japanese fighters were down. Only one Mustang didn't return. When Red landed, he took off his helmet and sat in silence for a long time. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just stared at the horizon where the sky was still faintly red from the setting sun. For the Japanese, morale began to collapse. Their once dominant air force, the pride of the empire, was being erased day by day. Their pilots called the P-51 the Silver Death, because it came from nowhere, struck fast, and disappeared into the sky. Rumors spread through the Japanese ranks that the Americans had built planes faster than sound, that their pilots could see through clouds, that they never ran out of bullets. Fear grew faster than the truth. In a single month, Japanese air losses tripled. Factories couldn't build new planes fast enough. Fuel was running out. The Empire's wings were breaking. But for the American pilots, it wasn't triumph. It was survival. Each mission pushed their endurance to the limit. 10-hour flights, constant danger, and the loneliness of the sky. They carried photos of loved ones taped to their dashboards, hoping each mission wouldn't be their last. They weren't fighting for glory anymore. They were fighting to end it. The war, the blood, the loss. And with every Japanese fighter that fell, they moved one step closer. The sky over Japan had changed forever. Where once the rising sun flag ruled, now flew the silver wings of the Mustang. And the message was clear: America had come, and it would not be stopped. March 9th, 1945. It was a calm evening in Tokyo. The streets were quiet. Families gathered in their wooden homes, children asleep, mothers cooking small meals with what little food was left. No one knew that in just a few hours, the sky above them would become a sea of fire. Far to the south, on the island of Tinian, hundreds of B-29 bombers waited on the runway. Each one was loaded with incendiary bombs, thousands of canisters filled with napalm and magnesium. And above them, like silent guardians, the P-51 Mustangs were ready to escort. Engines roared to life, propellers blurred into circles of steel. The night mission had begun. At 8:30 p.m., the first wave lifted into the dark sky. The sound was deafening. Hundreds of engines, thundering in unison. Inside each cockpit, pilots tightened their oxygen masks and checked their fuel gauges. The flight to Tokyo would take more than 7 hours. 7 hours of silence, waiting, and fear. At 2 a.m., the city appeared below them, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Tokyo was asleep. Then the first flares dropped. White light filled the streets, turning night into day. And moments later, the bombs followed. From above, the Mustang pilots could see everything. The waves of fire spreading block by block, the roofs collapsing, the rivers glowing red. It was like watching the earth itself burn. Captain William Hart later said, "It wasn't a battle anymore, it was hell unleashed." The Mustangs circled high, scanning for enemy fighters, but the Japanese Air Force barely rose to meet them. Most of their airfields had been destroyed, their fuel reserves almost gone. Only a few desperate Zeros took off that night. They never made it back. Down below, Tokyo was vanishing in smoke. The wooden houses, built close together, became fuel for the flames. The firestorm grew so hot that it melted glass and twisted metal into rivers. People ran toward the rivers for safety, but even the water boiled. By dawn, the city was gone. More than 100,000 people were dead. It was the most destructive air raid in human history. And when the smoke cleared, the Mustangs returned to base, their silver wings blackened by soot. No one spoke during the flight home. The radios were silent. They had done their duty, but none of them felt victorious. In the days that followed, the Japanese military realized the truth. They could no longer defend their skies. The Mustang dominated everything it touched, from the Pacific Islands to the Japanese mainland. Every time the air raid sirens wailed, people looked up and saw the silver wings cutting through the clouds. They called them the messengers of death. Children learned to recognize the sound of the Merlin engine, a deep, haunting growl that meant the Americans were near. Even Japanese pilots admitted defeat. One of them wrote in his diary, "When the Mustang appears, the fight is already over." By the summer of 1945, the Mustang had become a symbol, not just of power, but of inevitability. Wherever it flew, the war bent toward its end. The Allied bombers could now strike every corner of Japan, and the P-51s were there, always, to guard them, to clear the skies, to make sure no enemy returned alive. The Japanese Air Command issued desperate orders, suicide missions, kamikaze attacks, last stands, but the Mustangs hunted them relentlessly. Each mission took a piece of the empire away, and each day brought the war closer to collapse. One American pilot wrote home to his wife, "We're not fighting people anymore, we're fighting ghosts." And in many ways, he was right. By the time the last months of the war arrived, Japan's Air Force was a shadow, a memory of its former strength. The Mustang had taken its skies, and soon it would help end the war entirely. The fire over Tokyo marked more than destruction. It marked the beginning of the end. The world had changed forever that night. And the Mustang, with its roar and its silver wings, was the sound of that change. Summer 1945. The Pacific was a graveyard of ships and planes. The once mighty Japanese empire was shrinking, island by island, sky by sky, and now its last defenses were breaking. From the air bases on Iwo Jima, the P-51 Mustangs began their longest missions yet, escorting bombers deep into the Japanese homeland. 8 hours each way, nothing but ocean below. No landmarks, no rescue if something went wrong. Every pilot who took off knew that one small mistake, one engine failure, meant vanishing forever into the Pacific. Still, they flew. Ugh. The Mustangs had become ghosts of the sky, appearing suddenly, striking hard, and vanishing before the enemy could react. They attacked supply trains, airfields, and convoys. They strafed military bases and communication centers. Anything that moved, they hit. In one mission over Honshu, a squadron led by Major Robert Hawk Kersey spotted a line of Japanese trucks moving through a mountain pass. Without hesitation, he called it in. 8 Mustangs rolled into a dive, guns blazing. The road turned into fire and smoke. For miles, Japanese soldiers could see the tracers, thin red lines cutting through the air, and the sound that followed, the deep, terrifying growl of the Merlin engine. One survivor later said, "You didn't see the Mustang, you heard it, and then everything was gone." By July, Japan's cities were shattered. Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, all burned. The Mustang squadrons now focused on destroying what was left of Japan's Air Force, but there was almost nothing left to fight. The few remaining Japanese pilots were young, some barely 18. They had trained for weeks, not years. They were told that dying for the emperor was honor. So when they saw the Mustangs coming, they didn't turn away. In Okinawa, a Mustang squadron encountered a group of kamikaze planes heading toward the U.S. fleet. The sky erupted. The Mustangs dove in from above, intercepting them before they could reach the ships. Every second counted. Every bullet could mean hundreds of lives saved. By the end of the battle, 16 Japanese planes were destroyed, but 3 Mustang pilots never came back. War had become personal. Every pilot carried names, faces, memories. Each mission was no longer about strategy. It was about bringing everyone home alive. They flew through thunderstorms, through flak bursts, through the blinding light of explosions. And still, the Mustangs never failed. Their engines roared through the chaos, a sound that every American soldier came to love. To the men on the ground, that sound meant safety. It meant someone was up there, watching over them. Then came August, a month the world would never forget. The bombers flew again, this time toward Hiroshima. The Mustangs escorted them high above the clouds, unaware of what was coming. From their altitude, they saw a single flash, brighter than the sun. Then, silence. Even through their oxygen masks, they could feel the heat. No one spoke. They didn't understand what had happened, only that the world had just changed forever. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Another flash, another silence, and then it was over. When Japan finally surrendered, the Mustang pilots were in the air. They received the news over the radio. Mission canceled, return to base. For a moment, no one reacted. Then, across the radio channels came the sound of cheers, laughter, and tears. Some pilots simply flew higher, alone with their thoughts. Others looked down at the land below, a land they had fought over, bled over, and hoped never to see burn again. Weeks later, the Mustangs returned home. The hangars were decorated with flags and signs that read, "Welcome back, heroes." But many of the men who climbed out of those planes didn't feel like heroes. They were just survivors. They had seen too much, lost too many. Yet they knew one thing. Without the P-51 Mustang, the war might have lasted years longer. Thousands more might have died. The plane had done what it was built to do. It had changed the course of history. One mechanic wrote on the side of a Mustang before it was decommissioned, "You were more than metal. You were hope." And maybe he was right, because in the end, the Mustang was more than a fighter. It was a symbol of freedom, of power, and of what humanity can build when survival depends on it. The war ended. The engines went silent. But the legend of the P-51 Mustang never did. Even today, when you hear the deep, rolling growl of a Merlin engine, you can almost feel the ghosts of those who once flew it, high above the Pacific, carving victory from the sky. The war had ended, but the sound of the P-51 Mustang still echoed in the memories of those who heard it. Across airfields from Guam to England, the silver fighters sat quietly under the sun, engines cold, wings scarred by battle. Their job was done. Some were scrapped, some were stored away, and a few, the lucky ones, were flown home, their pilots refusing to leave them behind. To many, the Mustang wasn't just a machine. It was a brother, a partner, a guardian. They had trusted it with their lives, and it had brought them home. When peace returned, a new kind of war began. The race for the future. Jet engines, supersonic speeds, new technologies. The world was changing fast, and propeller-driven fighters were becoming history. But the Mustang refused to fade quietly. In 1950, when war broke out again, this time in Korea, the Mustang was called back into service. Now renamed the F-51, it returned to the skies, fighting alongside new jet fighters like the F-86 Sabre. It wasn't the fastest anymore, but it was reliable, powerful, and deadly accurate. While the jets soared high above, the Mustangs flew low, strafing enemy convoys, destroying bridges, and providing close air support for ground troops. Even in the age of jet engines, the Mustang still earned respect. Pilots in Korea called it the Old Warrior. It had scratches, bullet holes, patched-up panels. But when its Merlin engine roared, every man on the battlefield listened. One soldier wrote in his diary, "When you hear that sound above the smoke, you know you're not alone." For 5 more years, the Mustang fought once again. Not for glory, but for those on the ground who needed it most. When the jets ran out of range or fuel, the Mustang stayed. It always stayed. By the mid-1950s, technology finally caught up. The era of the propeller fighter was over. But the legend of the Mustang had already taken flight, not just in war, but in culture, in hearts, in history. It appeared in air shows, in movies, in museums. Pilots who once flew it now took their sons to see it, to show them the machine that changed their lives. And around the world, aviation lovers restored old Mustangs to flying condition, their polished silver bodies reflecting the sunlight once again. Every time one takes off, people look up, and for a moment, the world feels like 1944 again. But beyond the nostalgia, the Mustang left a permanent mark on aviation itself. Its aerodynamic design, the laminar flow wing, became a foundation for generations of aircraft to come. Its range, speed, and efficiency influenced everything from post-war bombers to modern long-range fighters. Even NASA used modified P-51s for high-altitude testing, pushing science forward just as it once pushed the limits of war. From destruction came discovery. And the story didn't end there. Private pilots around the world bought old Mustangs from military surplus, restoring them to their former glory. They flew them at air races, where the roar of the Merlin once again turned heads and shook the ground. In the Reno air races, Mustangs became kings of the sky once more, racing at over 500 miles per hour, their pilots grinning like children behind the stick. Decades after the war, the same machine that once brought terror to Japan now brought joy to thousands of spectators watching from the ground. Time had transformed the symbol of war into a celebration of flight. Even today, there are fewer than 300 Mustangs left flying. Each one is a piece of history, a reminder of courage, sacrifice, and the thin line between life and death in the sky. When they fly over air shows, veterans look up, eyes filled with tears. For them, it's not just a plane. It's a memory of youth, of fear, of survival. One old pilot, when asked what the Mustang meant to him, simply said, "It was freedom. It was everything." And maybe that's the truth. Because the Mustang wasn't just a machine built to kill. It was built to endure. It carried the weight of a world at war, and it carried it well. Its story didn't end in 1945. It lives on in museums, in movies, and in the hearts of those who still believe that sometimes a machine can have a soul. Every machine has a story, but the P-51 Mustang had thousands, written not in ink, but in smoke, fire, and courage. The men who flew it carried those stories for the rest of their lives. Some told them, most never did. One of them was Captain Richard "Rick" Martin, a 23-year-old from Kansas who joined the Army Air Forces in 1943. He'd never flown anything before the war. 2 years later, he was flying a P-51 Mustang over Tokyo. Rick used to say that flying the Mustang felt like wearing wings. It didn't feel like a machine. It felt alive. On his 19th mission, Rick's squadron was ambushed by a group of Zeros over Nagoya. He was hit, engine smoking, wings torn apart. But the Mustang kept flying. He managed to glide nearly 200 miles back toward Iwo Jima before running out of fuel. He crash-landed in the ocean and was rescued by a Navy submarine 3 hours later. When they pulled him aboard, his first words were, "Did she make it?" He wasn't asking about himself. He was asking about the plane. Another story came from Lieutenant George Freeman, a young African-American pilot from the Tuskegee Airmen, the legendary Red Tails. George flew his P-51, named Lady Liberty, on escort missions over Germany and later in the Pacific. He faced 2 battles, one in the air and one against racism on the ground. But in the sky, none of that mattered. He once said, "Up there, color didn't mean anything. Only skill did." George and his squadron earned a reputation for never losing a single bomber under their escort. Their red-tailed Mustangs became symbols of discipline and excellence. After the war, when asked how he felt flying the P-51, George smiled and said, "It was like God handed me lightning and told me to be careful." Then there was Major Charles "Chuck" Weaver, one of the few pilots to score 5 confirmed kills in a single day. He called it the longest 10 minutes of my life. The fight took place near Kyushu, Japan. Weaver and his wingman spotted a large formation of Japanese fighters heading toward American bombers. Outnumbered 5-1, they dove straight into the formation. The radio was chaos, warnings, screams, static, gunfire. By the time it was over, the sky was full of smoke and burning wreckage. Weaver's plane had taken 19 bullet holes, but he was still flying. When he landed, a mechanic asked him how he did it. Weaver just laughed and said, "She did it. I just hung on." But not all stories ended in triumph. Some ended in silence. Lieutenant Frank Reynolds, 24 years old from Oregon, never came home. His squadron lost him somewhere over the Sea of Japan. His radio went dead mid-mission. No one ever found his plane. Years later, a Japanese fisherman reported seeing a silver wing rising from the seabed during a storm. They never confirmed if it was his. Frank's mother received a letter months after the war ended. Inside it read, "He fought bravely. He gave everything for the men beside him. He was one of us." And that's all she ever knew. Some pilots returned, but they never really left the war behind. They'd wake up at night, hearing the roar of the Merlin engine in their dreams. Some couldn't stand the silence of peace. It was too quiet, too empty. But others found peace in flying again. Civilian Mustangs gave them a reason to go back to the skies. Not for war this time, but for love, for the feeling of freedom that only those wings could give. One pilot, Edward Eddie Lawson, summed it up best. He flew 67 missions in the Pacific. He lost friends, he lost faith, but never lost his love for the Mustang. In an interview decades later, an old man with trembling hands and tired eyes said, "When I close my eyes, I still see her nose shining in the sunlight. The sound of that engine was the sound of life. Everything else came after." These were not superheroes. They were ordinary men in extraordinary machines. They didn't fight for fame or medals. They fought because someone had to. And in doing so, they wrote their names into the sky, forever carried by the silver wings of the Mustang. When the guns fell silent and the war was over, the sound of the P-51's Merlin engine faded into history. But its echo never really stopped. For many, the Mustang wasn't just a plane. It was a symbol of freedom, courage, and raw power that changed the course of the war. In the late 1940s, when veterans came home, many brought pieces of their planes with them, a small part of the machine that had once carried them through fire and fear. Some turned those memories into museums. Others rebuilt Mustangs from scrap metal, giving them new life, restoring the sound that once shook the skies of Europe and Japan. And soon, the world began to fall in love with the Mustang all over again. Hollywood saw it first. Movies like the Tuskegee Airmen, Empire of the Sun, and Red Tails brought the P-51 back to the big screen. Shining, roaring, unstoppable. Directors used it not just as a piece of machinery, but as a character, a living thing that represented heroism and hope. You could hear the Mustang before you saw it, that deep, sharp growl of the Merlin engine. It was the sound of history itself. In air shows around the world, people watched as restored P-51s danced across the sky. The pilots who flew them were often second-generation sons and daughters of the men who once fought in them. Each time one of those planes lifted off the ground, it felt like the past was rising with it. Children stared in awe, veterans watched with tears in their eyes. Because for them, that sound meant survival. It meant home. In Japan, the Mustang's legacy carried a different weight. It was once a symbol of fear, a silver predator that ruled the skies. But over time, even there, it came to represent respect, the ultimate opponent, a machine that defined a generation of aerial warfare. Today, in Japanese museums, you can find restored P-51 models displayed beside Zero fighters, not as enemies, but as equals in history, both sides honoring the courage of those who flew them. The Mustang also shaped the future of aviation. Its design inspired decades of aircraft engineering. Its sleek frame, powerful engine, and long-range capability became the foundation for modern fighter development. Engineers studied its balance, its speed, its perfect harmony between power and control. The result? Jet fighters that carried its DNA into the skies of the Cold War and beyond. But perhaps the most powerful part of its legacy wasn't the machine itself. It was the people who never forgot it. Even today, pilots say flying a Mustang feels like touching history. It's not just nostalgia, it's connection. It's remembering what it cost to keep the world free. One veteran once said during an air show, watching a Mustang thunder overhead, "That's the sound of every friend who didn't make it home. That's the sound of their wings." And in that moment, everyone watching understood. The P-51 Mustang was never just metal and rivets. It was memory. It was sacrifice. It was freedom given wings. Every legend has its secret. For the P-51 Mustang, that secret was written in its wings. The Mustang wasn't born a masterpiece. It became one. When North American aviation first designed it, it wasn't even meant to be America's main fighter. It was just a desperate project, a rush order for Britain who needed planes fast. But from the moment the first prototype touched the sky, engineers realized they had built something different, something ahead of its time. The magic began with the laminar flow wing design, a revolutionary concept that made the Mustang glide through air with less drag, giving it unmatched speed and efficiency. While other planes fought the air, the Mustang cut through it like a knife through silk. Then came the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a partnership between American production and British genius. That engine transformed the Mustang from a good fighter into an apex predator. It could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything else in the war. At 437 miles per hour, it could chase down bombers and still outrun enemy interceptors. At 30,000 feet, it could dance with the best pilots the Axis had to offer. But speed wasn't what terrified the Japanese pilots most. It was range. Before the Mustang, American bombers had a deadly problem. They could reach deep into enemy territory, but their escort fighters couldn't. The B-29s and B-17s would fly over Japan or Germany and die alone. The P-51 changed that forever. With drop tanks attached under its wings, it could escort bombers from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back again, a journey that once seemed impossible. Suddenly, Japanese pilots found no safety anywhere. Even over their own homeland, the sky was filled with the silver streaks of Mustangs. The plane's guns were just as lethal. 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 on each wing, capable of tearing through armor and slicing a Zero to pieces in seconds. Its pilots said that when you fired all 6 at once, the entire plane would shudder like it was roaring with you. And yet, it was graceful. Stable at high speed, gentle in turns, and easy to control even for new pilots. That's what made it so dangerous. It didn't demand perfection from its pilot. It forgave mistakes. It let ordinary men do extraordinary things. Japanese pilots couldn't understand it. They would dive, turn, climb, but the Mustang followed. Always there. Always behind them. The predator that never stopped hunting. They called it the Devil's Horse. Because no matter how fast they ran, the Mustang was faster. And when it finally caught up, its guns spoke with thunder. The Mustang wasn't built for comfort either. The cockpit was small, hot, and loud. The pilots often flew for 7 or 8 hours straight, with nothing but the engine's roar and the heartbeat of war to keep them company. But they loved it. They trusted it. They said the Mustang felt alive, like it wanted to win as much as they did. When historians look back, they often say technology won the war. But the truth is more human than that. Technology gave the Allies a chance. The Mustang gave them hope. It gave them the sky. As 1945 drew to a close, the P-51 stood as the undisputed ruler of the air. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was now a fading memory, a ghost replaced by a new legend of steel and fire. But the story of the Mustang wasn't finished yet, because even after the war ended, it would fly again, in Korea, in movies, in hearts. Its legacy wasn't just written in victories, it was written in freedom. Decades have passed since the last dogfight of World War II. The skies are quieter now, but if you listen closely at an airfield somewhere in America, you can still hear it. The deep, rolling growl of a Merlin engine. It's the sound of the P-51 Mustang taking flight once more. The same wings that once carried young men across oceans now lift gently into the modern sky. Not for battle, but for remembrance. Every year, at air shows and memorial events, veterans, families, and young pilots gather to watch the Mustang rise. It's more than a plane to them. It's a story made of metal and courage. When that engine roars, it feels like time folds in on itself. For a few precious moments, 1944 lives again. In those moments, people remember. They remember the pilots who never came home, the ones who fought through fire and fear, the ones who stared death in the eye and refused to blink. The Mustang carries all of them. Their courage, their hope, their final flight. Today, only a few hundred Mustangs remain airworthy, each one restored with care, each one a living monument to those who flew them. Some are painted in bright silver with their old squadron insignias, others wear the scars of time, faded paint, worn metal, but still proud, still powerful. When they take off, people stop whatever they're doing, because they know they're not just watching a plane, they're watching history breathe again. The world has changed. Jets now rule the skies, drones fly where no pilot ever could, but none of them carry the soul that the Mustang did. None of them will ever mean as much, because the P-51 wasn't built only for war. It was built for purpose. It represented what happens when courage, innovation, and desperation collide, when ordinary people build something extraordinary in the darkest hour of humanity. In museums around the world, you'll find Mustangs resting beside Spitfires, Zeros, and Messerschmitts, not as enemies anymore, but as relics of a time when men fought in the clouds to decide the fate of the Earth. Each one tells a story. Each one whispers the same message. Never forget what it took to be free. And so every time a P-51 takes off today, it carries more than just fuel and metal. It carries memory. It carries honor. It carries the sound of a generation that refused to surrender. The last surviving Mustang pilots are few now. Their hands tremble, their voices fade, but their eyes still light up when they hear that engine. One of them, in his 90s, was once asked, "What did it feel like to fly the P-51? He smiled and said softly, "It felt like flying freedom itself." As the plane disappears into the horizon, its silver wings glint in the sunlight, the same light that once guided it home after long, bloody missions. And maybe, just maybe, as it fades into the clouds, you can still hear the ghosts of those who flew before, their laughter, their courage, their eternal flight, because legends never die. They just take off one more time into the endless sky. The end. The story of the P-51 Mustang, the plane that saved the skies and the men who gave it a soul.